Hello everyone, and welcome to our very first lecture of 2021. If you were in my class last semester, you're probably kind of familiar with how the format goes, but what I like to do is record and post my lectures in advance. I just find that it makes it a little bit easier for students to be able to kind of be a little more flexible in watching them when they want to. And so basically what we do during class time is I just log on to a Moodle classroom, a Moodle chat room, and you can come and ask me any questions you might have. I do always have Zoom reviews before any tests, and I also have a couple extra classes kind of kicking around this semester. Our semester is a little longer than usual, so we will have plenty of extra time to kind of get together and ask questions and things like that. But for the most part, I recognize classes at 8:30 in the morning, and not everyone is able to or wants to be up and listening at that point, so hopefully having the lectures pre-recorded makes things a little bit easier on you. If you already know me, you know who I am, but I will share a little bit about myself. So as you probably know by now, my name is Sally Payne. I've completed both a master's and a bachelor's degree in psychology through the Memorial University of Newfoundland, and I'm actually currently completing my doctorate of clinical psychology through that university. If it wasn't for COVID, honestly, I wouldn't even still be in this province. But of course, as you know, everything is online right now, so I've been fortunate enough to keep my position here while also attending school full-time through Memorial. So my office is BB 110. We'll probably never meet there just because of the current situation. Nothing is really going on campus. But if for some strange reason I need to be on campus, that's where you'll find me. It's in the Brody building, basically in the same hallway as all the other psych profs. My email address is probably the most important piece of information on this slide. That's the best way to contact me. I check my email regularly. It comes straight to my phone. I won't always be able to respond immediately. Obviously, I do have, a full-time school plus a couple other part-time positions in addition to this one. So I'm not always immediately available, but I definitely try to get back to you as quickly as possible. And you can ask me questions about course content, about psychology, if there's anything in particular you're interested in, and I'll do my best to answer any questions that you might have. So this semester we're going to start with chapter 9, which is on intelligence testing. It is a pretty short chapter. There's not a ton to it. I try to keep it fairly brief because typically intelligence testing is something that's kind of combined with the cognition chapter, because our kind of biopsych chapter was combined. We used to have 2 in biopsych and only 1 in cognition. But because those biopsych chapters were combined, so we now only have 1 in the first half, we have a full chapter devoted to intelligence testing in the second half. So it won't be too long. We'll go through some of the major theories in intelligence, and hopefully it's something that you find interesting and enjoyable. And as with any of the lectures, if you have any questions, you can always pop on during our class time and ask questions. I will have kind of a lecture assigned for each specific class that you can come and ask questions about, or you can always email me at the email address on the previous slide. So let's get started. So there's a lot of debate, as you probably know, surrounding what intelligence really is. When we say that someone is intelligent, what is it that we actually mean? Do we mean that they're able to reason abstractly, that they're able to learn and profit from their experiences, they're able to think rationally, or perhaps even just the ability to kind of act in a purposeful way? So there are a lot of different definitions, and sometimes conflicting definitions as to what intelligence really is. So there's something known as the psychometric approach, which focuses on an individual's performance on standard aptitude tests. So things like IQ tests, which you've probably all heard of, that would be a way of measuring intelligence psychometrically. So it's basically designed to measure the ability to acquire skills and knowledge. So how good you are at learning. However, that psychometric approach doesn't always give us the full picture, so sometimes we use what we call a more cognitive approach to measuring intelligence, and we'll get into the distinction between the two a little bit later in the chapter. So this chapter is basically going to help us examine the many ways in which we've attempted to measure intelligence, from as far back as the 1800s to how we presently measure it today. So our first module, 9.1, is about specifically measuring intelligence. So the one thing that all scientists do agree on is that it is important to measure things properly. If you were in my class last semester, you definitely heard me talk about this a lot, and I'm sure whoever you had for The first part of intro would have talked about this a lot, but when we're measuring anything in psychology or anything in science in general, we want our measurements to be reliable and valid as possible. So it sounds logical that, we want to measure things accurately, measure things properly, but the story of Leilani Muir, which is shared at the beginning of this textbook chapter, underscores the importance of measuring things correctly. So unfortunately, it's a pretty tragic story. There was a woman named Leilani Muir, and she was from Alberta. And later in her life, she was attempting to conceive. She wanted to have a child, and she went to the doctor because she was struggling with issues with infertility. And when the doctor examined her, they found that she actually didn't have any fallopian tubes. They had been burned away. So she had been essentially medically sterilized. And basically what had happened to her was that without her knowledge, she had been sterilized simply because she failed to meet a cutoff on an IQ test. So at the time, and this wasn't too long ago, and it was here in Canada, in Alberta, but at the time, basically, what they said was that if you were below a certain threshold, and they had a cutoff of 70 in their mind for what you could score on an IQ test, then you should be medically sterilized and should not be able to reproduce. I guess with the logic being that you would pass on your low IQ to your offspring, which is as horrible as it sounds, to be honest. And so basically what had happened is she had went in, I believe, for what was supposed to be an appendectomy to remove her appendix, and she came out and, everything seemed fine. They sent her on her way, and it wasn't until years later that she was trying to conceive that they actually discovered the damage that had been done. So they had medically sterilized her without her consent and without her permission, simply because her original IQ score, when it was tested back then, was around 64, which was below that cutoff of 70. And the most shocking part of the story, if you can believe it, because obviously it's all pretty shocking, is that later in life, when her IQ was measured, she actually scored an 89, which is very, very close to an average level of intelligence. And I say average with air quotes. So definitely a very sad story, but one that really underscores just how important it is to measure things correctly. Because obviously in that case, it should never have been done regardless of what her IQ score was, but it's almost even more shocking that when tested later in life, her IQ score was, 25 points greater. And so she had been sterilized when she was below that cutoff, but in reality, she may not have been that entire time. So it's a very important thing to kind of keep in mind, that when we're measuring these things, we want to be as accurate, as valid as possible. So the first attempt to measure intelligence in the modern era began with Francis Galton, who argued that sensory ability should be an indicator of intelligence. So basically he figured that, if you had good eyesight and good hearing and good sense of smell and taste and things like that, that would be linked to a higher level of intelligence. So in 1884, Galton created a set of 17 sensory tasks, and he began testing participants in his anthropometric laboratory. Anthropometric. And so when we're talking about anthropometrics, we're talking about the measurement of people. Anthro is usually to do with people. If you've heard of anthropology, it's kind of the study of people and culture. And so anthropometrics is the measurement of people. So the methods of measuring both physical and mental variation within humans. James Cattell, who was one of Galton's colleagues, so Galton was located in England, he brought Galton's tests to the United States, and he used them to measure the abilities of university students. So basically he was trying to use these sensory tests to measure, their vision and their hearing and things like that. But what he found was that the student scores on these sensory tests did not predict their grades. And so Galton's approach to measuring intelligence was generally abandoned. So he actually found that there were very weak, if any, correlations between the abilities on the different tasks. So, someone with great vision might not necessarily have great hearing or a great sense of smell. And not only that it didn't generally seem to predict intelligence levels at all. So that approach was pretty much abandoned at that point. But watch out for Galton, because we'll talk about him again a little bit later on. So in contrast to Galton, a French psychologist named Alfred Binet argued that intelligence should be indicated by more complex thinking processes, such as memory, attention, and comprehension, which is closer to what we would kind of consider IQ or intelligence today in a lot of cases. So this led us to that most common present-day definition of intelligence as being the ability to think, understand, reason, and adapt to or overcome obstacles that we encounter. So in 1904, so about 20 years after Galton kind of first created those sensory tests and proposed that theory of intelligence, Binet and his colleague Theodore Simon were asked by the French government, they were located in France, the French government to find a way to identify children who were slow learners and may benefit from more specialized education. So their goal was to basically identify children who may be struggling in school and help them kind of get ahead. They created a test comprised of 30 tasks, and they arranged them in order of increasing difficulty. So you'd start with the easier tasks and kind of move up the better you did. And they administered this test to children from different age groups. So what Binet and Simon noticed was that the responses of the dull children resembled those of children of a younger age. So the children who weren't doing as well, kind of as would be expected on these tasks, they tended to perform in a manner that would be expected of children of a younger age. Whereas bright children seemed to give responses characteristics of older children. So it kind of seemed like they were thinking in ways kind of beyond their current age. So therefore he decided that a child's test score was measuring what became known as the mental age. So the average intellectual ability score for children of a specific age. So essentially, based on that, he said that a child with a mental age that's lower than their chronological age would be expected to struggle more in school and require remedial education. So that was basically his purpose for creating that test, was to identify which children might be falling behind and which children might need a little bit of extra help or remedial education in order to help them succeed in school. It's very important to keep in mind that that was the original purpose, because when intelligence testing was brought to North America, its purpose became very twisted and very far from that original purpose of kind of identifying who might need a little extra help. So Binet and Simon's test was well received. It seemed pretty useful. It was very helpful. And soon researchers in the United States began to adapt it for their own use. So Lewis Terman, he was a very influential person in terms of kind of intelligence testing. He was a psychologist who worked at Stanford University, and he adapted Binet and Simon's original test for American children. So his version was called the Stanford-Binet Intelligence Scale, Stanford being where he worked, and Binet, of course, being Alfred Binet, the original creator of the test. So Terman described this Stanford-Binet test as a test intended to measure innate levels of intelligence. And innate basically means something that's kind of inborn. It's something that is with you from birth, so kind of genetic in origin typically. And this, like I was kind of mentioning earlier, differed substantially from Binet's original purpose. So Binet was not attempting to measure the inborn level of intelligence that children had. He was simply attempting to identify who might be struggling and who might need extra help. So that's what I was talking about when I said the purpose really kind of got twisted when intelligence testing was brought to North America. So in order to indicate level of intelligence, because of course you need a way to score these tests and kind of compare people to others, Terman adopted William Stern's concept of intelligence quotient, or IQ. So you've all heard of IQ before. That stands for an intelligence quotient. A score calculated by taking a person's mental age, dividing it by their chronological age, and then multiplying by 100. And so this kind of makes sense based on Binet's original reasoning that, you know, a student who was struggling would basically score the same as someone of a lower age. So by taking that mental age, saying, you know, even if that 10-year-old is only operating at an 8-year-old level, then what you're going to do is take that 8 in terms of their mental age, divide it by the chronological age of 10, and then multiply it by 100 to get your IQ score. So in that case, the IQ would be 80. So basically by calculating the IQ score in this way, they were able to kind of place whether a child was kind of exactly where they should be, or if they were behind, if they were below 100, or if they were doing kind of better, they were more advanced than they typically would be at that age, which would be a score of above 100. Because of course, if you were exactly at the age that you were supposed to be, it would be your age divided by itself, which would give you 1 multiplied by 100, so it gives you that middle ground score of 100. Unfortunately, this method of computing IQ has some major flaws. Certain ages saw scores that were very tightly clustered around the mean, whereas other ages had greatly dispersed scores. So obviously we know that in childhood, there are so many changes occurring at such a rapid rate that, you know, the difference between a 2 and a 4 and a 6 and an 8-year-old, they're very substantial differences. So we did see, you know, certain ages, the scores were very similar to each other, whereas for other ages, they were way more spread out. And of course, you might be thinking that this didn't really apply very well to adults. Because what's the difference? You know, the difference between a 4-year-old and an 8-year-old in terms of what they know and what they can accomplish, compared to the difference between a 25-year-old and a 30-year-old, it's very different, right? You know, you're not really generally making that much improvement in terms of your skills and abilities once you reach adulthood. So today we score IQ tests much differently by using what we call a deviation IQ, and I'll show you a graph of that in a minute, which compares a person's test score with the average score for people of the same age. So instead of comparing it to their mental age, you know, their mental age to the age that they actually are, we're going to compare them with the average of people that are at their age. So we're using basically norms of populations to help us compare. So deviation IQ scores should approximate a normal distribution, with 2/3 of the scores falling within one standard deviation, which is set at 15 points, of the mean. And again, as I mentioned, the mean is 100 because that will be, you know, based on the original IQ scoring, that would be the age at which your abilities are right where they should be. So anyone who's scoring above 100 would be scoring greater than average, anyone below would be less than average. And with a standard deviation set at 15 points, that gives us kind of ranges in which you can fall. So, you know, if you're falling between 85 and 100, you're within one standard deviation. If you have a score of, say, 132, well, that's over 2 standard deviations above the mean. So you can kind of use that to estimate how rare a certain score might be and kind of place people in comparison to other people of the same age. And so you can see right here, we have the normal distribution. And I know that I very briefly talked about this in the chapter on research methods when we started talking about the statistics. So you don't really need to kind of memorize this chart or anything, but it's important to know that obviously the further you go away from that mean, the more rare those scores become, right? Because in a normal distribution, the majority of people fall within one standard deviation plus or minus from the mean. So you can see here, 68% of people fall within plus or minus 1. Within plus or minus 2 standard deviations, we see 95% of people. So anyone who's either below 70 or above 30, that's going to be, you know, only 5% of your population. And so in that way, we can kind of compare people based on their score to other people and to kind of the population in general. So 2 decades later, there was a researcher named David Wechsler, and he is one of the most important and influential names in intelligence testing. He designed an intelligence test for adults, which was known as the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale, or the WAIS. So it's the most common intelligence test in use today for adolescents and adults. It's something that has been very influential. It's actually something that I myself will be trained in very shortly. I should have been already, but with COVID it hasn't been possible. But that is one that even in clinical psych programs, you know, it's still emphasized as kind of the main IQ test that we typically use. So Wechsler tests produced not only a general intelligence score, so kind of your main full-scale IQ, but also specific scores for different abilities, such as verbal comprehension, processing speed, perceptual reasoning, and working memory. So we are giving a general overall score, but we're also able to kind of look a little bit more closely at specific abilities that the person might be showing. So the abilities fit into 2 main categories. There's the General Ability Index, or the GAI, and the Cognitive Proficiency Index, or the CPI. So basically, it's kind of like you have your full score, you have these 2 categories kind of within it, the general and the cognitive proficiency, and then each of those are broken down a little bit further. So you get a bit more of a detailed picture regarding, you know, the strengths and weaknesses of any particular person versus the original Stanford Binet IQ test is just going to give you that one full-scale IQ score, and that's it. So here's a little figure that kind of shows you very nice and neat how the subscales of the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale work. You don't really need to kind of memorize this or anything, but just to show you some of the things that you can kind of gain from looking at a report based on this scale. And here are some examples of some of the types of problems that you might see on the WAIS. So with the processing speed index, you can have things like symbol searches and coding. For working memory, it's very common to do arithmetic and digit spans, so how many things you can kind of recall, and if you can do, say, a math problem kind of in your head. With the perceptual reasoning, there's a lot of like matrix reasoning and pattern recognition and things like that. Block design, again, is kind of more pattern recognition. You're trying to determine what pieces you might need to fill a puzzle or what might come next in a pattern. Then you have the verbal comprehension index, which is a lot about, what vocabulary you have and if you're able to kind of note similarities between words and, just your general knowledge of facts and information as well. So despite widespread usage, as I mentioned, the WAIS is still used today most commonly as an intelligence test for adults and adolescents, and the Stanford Binet was used for many, many years and still is in a lot of cases. But both of these tests have been criticized by a number of researchers, primarily due to the fact that their questions are often biased to favor people from the test developers' culture. So unfortunately, that is a major, major issue in intelligence testing, and in a lot of testing, but specifically in intelligence testing as well, that a lot of these tests are very culturally biased. So, if you are looking at a test and it's asking you stuff like what are the capitals of the states, or, who was the 5th president, well, how is that a very fair evaluation of intelligence for somebody who isn't from America? Right? And so that's what we see a lot of the time, that these tests can be very culturally biased in terms of the situations they describe and the facts that they ask about. So in response to this criticism, psychologists have tried to develop what they call a culture-free test. In the 1930s, John Raven developed what was known as Raven's progressive matrices, which is an intelligence test that's based entirely on pictures, not words. So it's actually, all things that don't need to be read. They don't require a good grasp of the English language to answer the questions. So this makes it relatively unaffected by language or cultural background. And this is kind of an example. So it's, again, you saw things that were similar to this on the WAIS. There are some sections that were, but a lot did rely on kind of verbal comprehension and language ability, whereas something like Raven's progressive matrices was all patterns and things like that. It was nothing verbal. It was all kind of visual and spatial. Unfortunately, as intelligence tests became more widespread, they were at times used for less positive purposes. So we are going to talk a bit about what we call the checkered past of intelligence testing. As much as we have tried, in recent years to kind of use intelligence testing for good and to help us kind of highlight people's strengths and understand their weaknesses so that we can help them, that wasn't really always the purpose for which they were being used. So there were some social visionaries, and I put that in quotations there because a lot of what they did was truly awful. They attempted to apply Darwin's ideas about evolution and natural selection to human culture. And I'm sure you're all familiar with Darwin and natural selection, but basically, to kind of recap, it would be survival of the fittest, right? So applying that to intelligence, it would say, kind of very similar to what happened to Leilani Muir, who we discussed at the beginning of this module, that we should only let the people who have the best genes reproduce. That we shouldn't allow people who have, low intelligence or, mental or physical deficits to reproduce because they're not passing on the best genes that they could possibly be. And of course, this is an awful idea and goes against, human rights and a lot of other things, but there were a lot of people who did think that way, and unfortunately probably still are in a lot of cases. So this social Darwinism, as they called it, led to the rise of eugenics, which literally translated means good genes. But basically that's exactly what I was just talking about. Eugenics would be saying that we should only allow people who have what they would say, and again, air quotes, superior genes to be the ones who reproduce and pass on that genetic information. It was Francis Galton, I told you to watch out for him because he comes back at this point, who coined this term. So the guy who was wrong in the first place about sensory ability being kind of that main indicator of intelligence was also wrong again about eugenics. He came up with the term, And unfortunately, his views influenced Lewis Terman, who promoted a very eugenic philosophy. So Lewis Terman being the one who created that Stanford Binet intelligence test. So he basically believed that IQ test provided a strong empirical justification for eugenic practice. So based on the results of those tests, we should be allowed to choose who is able and is not able to reproduce. As Terman administered his tests to more people, it seemed like these beliefs may have been verified by the data, but there were many critiques, and so we're going to get into some of them now. But unfortunately, there were things that kind of did seem to support his view at the time, and that didn't really help the case in getting those practices to stop. So that may be why some of those practices unfortunately persisted for a very long time. So here are some problems with the racial superiority interpretation. And one of the main things when we were looking at intelligence testing, and I kind of touched on this when I talked about the cultural bias, is that intelligence tests were very biased towards the ethnicity and the cultural background of their developers. And so the simplest critique in saying that, the ones with the highest IQ are the smartest, and that means that certain, ethnicities and cultures are superior to others, is that the tests themselves are culturally biased, as we just talked about. We can't have somebody from America and then somebody from, say, a rural place in Africa or in, Eastern Asia complete the same test if it's based on knowledge that's specific to America. That's not fair. That kind of basically ensures that people from different cultures are going to have lower scores, and then that information can be used against them to kind of try to promote eugenics and things like that. So it's really terrible. And researchers have spent a great deal of time trying to create less biased tests, but even that in itself can be problematic. And one of the reasons for that is that even when the tests themselves are not biased, so for example the Raven's matrices that we talked about earlier, the process of testing itself might be. So think of the fact that, even if you have a test that's all pattern recognition and visual, and you don't have any language, do you think somebody who attends, an elite private school in the US who's used to having all kinds of testing and, are comfortable in that format, that's kind of what they do every day of their lives, don't you think they're still going to fare better than somebody who's from a rural nation that's main source of income is agriculture, and they've never written a formal test in their life? Like, it really, even when the test itself is not biased, that doesn't mean there still isn't bias in terms of the testing process. And the fact that, certain cultures and certain people are more familiar with testing and they're more comfortable with it. And cultural background has been found to affect many aspects of the testing process. IQ differences may also be due in part to what we call stereotype threat, which is a very real and a very important phenomenon to discuss. So essentially it refers to when negative stereotypes about a group cause members to underperform on ability tasks. So if a certain group has been told that they're less intelligent, or told that they're not as good at a certain subject or a certain type of testing, then they are actually more likely to show that in their results. If they know of that stereotype, it can affect their performance. It can take effect in a number of ways, one of which is by increasing arousal. So just the fact that you're aware that there's a negative stereotype about you is going to obviously impact your performance by making you probably more worried and more kind of aroused, which will affect your test performance. It can cause people to become more self-focused, so they spend so much time thinking about themselves and kind of trying not to give in to that stereotype that, again, they lose that focus on the test. And they're unable to perform as well as they may have, and causing people to actively try to inhibit their negative thoughts. So even if they don't believe the stereotype and they're sitting there trying to, push that from their mind, that's still going to take away cognitive resources that could have been used to help them succeed on the test. So all of these factors kind of combine to make it really difficult for a group that has been marginalized or has those negative stereotypes about them to succeed in standardized testing. And that's why, as we just kind of talked about, it's not always about the test itself. There are a lot of aspects of that testing process as well that can influence results. There have been over 200 studies on stereotype threat indicating that it occurs reliably and regularly affects the test scores of those from suppressed groups. So it is a very real phenomenon, and it is something that's unfortunately been very influential in kind of showing us those different testing scores between cultures and different ethnicities and things like that. It has nothing to do with a race being superior and everything to do with the race believing they're superior and then kind of, you know, creating these stereotypes and creating these tests that other ethnicities just aren't going to perform as well on. And so another important critique is that even if one believes that the tests are valid and the intelligence differences between groups exist, this still does not necessarily mean that they are the result of innate differences. So say you do test, you know, a group, a group of, say, you know, Caucasian people who live in, I don't know, I'm trying to think of a rich place in the US. So people who are pretty well off, they have a good education, you know, they have a lot of things going for them, and you test them compared to a group of students from kind of an inner city school, and you know, they may be of a different ethnicity, but that might not have anything to do with it. It might just be the fact that they don't have the resources, they don't have the same advantages in terms of schooling and education and, you know, extracurricular activities, and that's obviously going to influence scores as well. So it could have a lot to do with the environment and not genetics itself. And finally, the life experiences of people from disadvantaged groups may encourage them to adopt certain beliefs about themselves and their abilities, which may then interfere with their motivation to perform. So that's really related to the stereotype threat. So not only can stereotype threat kind of directly influence people when they're attempting to kind of complete a test or things like that, but it can also even just kind of become so ingrained in the individual that they're not supposed to succeed at something that they lose their motivation to even try, and that's really devastating. You know, I in a way I hate this section because it shows me a lot of really negative things that we've done, but at the same time I really think it's so important to talk about this stuff because, you know, it can hopefully help alleviate some of that confusion and help people kind of see just where these biases are coming from and how kind of negatively they can be impacting performance. So it's a tough topic to talk about, but it's also something that I consider really important to keep in mind. So finally, we're going to talk a bit about certain types of beliefs about intelligence. So your text examines beliefs about intelligence by working through the scientific literacy model. Again, if you were in my class last semester, or even if you weren't and you were using the Krauss textbook, you've probably been pretty familiar with these scientific literacy model sections, and they're pretty great. They kind of go step by step through certain examples and why is it relevant and what the evidence says. And so basically it has been shown that many people hold implicit beliefs that their intelligence level is relatively fixed. So they have this idea that, you know, you are either intelligent or you're not, you're born with it. It's something that doesn't really change over time. But in fact, it is something that is highly changeable. So despite the fact that a lot of people hold that belief, it's not accurate. So people in general seem to hold one of two theories about the nature of intelligence. The entity theory, which is kind of what we were just talking about, the belief that intelligence is a fixed characteristic and relatively difficult or even impossible to change, or incremental theory, which is the belief that intelligence can be shaped by experiences, practice, and effort. And that's the one that, you know, I find kind of most beneficial, and it is really true. Intelligence is highly changeable. But unfortunately, when people have that kind of entity theory belief, it can make it really hard for them to see intelligence as changeable, and therefore they may not try as hard to kind of improve. So luckily, as we'll talk about here, those who held entity beliefs were more likely to give up when faced with challenging problems, and those with incremental views were more resilient. But we did find that it is possible to teach incremental views. So obviously, if we're looking at it and we see that, you know, people who are holding entity beliefs are more likely to give up when they're faced with challenges because they just believe, you know, well, intelligence is just not something I have. It's just not something I'm good at. And then the incremental viewpoint kind of says, okay, you know, even if I'm not good at it now, I can try and I can improve. So obviously, you know, of the two, you would probably see that one as more desirable. And what we have done is we have tested students to see whether incremental views could be taught. And the group who was taught incremental theory, so they were kind of taught that intelligence is changeable and that it's something that we can improve upon, they actually saw an increase in grades throughout the year, while the control group, who wasn't taught that incremental theory, saw a slight decline over time. So it was a very interesting and kind of promising result, but unfortunately, you know, it's still a little unclear what the specific applications and mechanisms involved might be. So there's definitely still more research to be done, but it was very promising to see that just because somebody has kind of grown up and kind of has that entity type belief that's saying, you know, intelligence is either there or it's not, you either got it or you don't, that it is something we're able to improve upon. And finally, we just have a graph here that's kind of from that study we just talked about. So if you look, you see the pink line here is talking about students who were taught incremental theory, whereas the blue is basically students who believed in the entity theory that, you know, intelligence was unchanging and they weren't really trained or taught about the incremental theory. We did see that over time their grades actually increased. So it does seem that being taught about incremental theory really helped them internalize some of those ideas and helped improve their performance. So that is it for Module 1. That's kind of a brief synopsis of some of the psychometric approach to intelligence so far and some of the tests that we've created and things like that. In the next module, we will talk a bit more about some particular theories of intelligence. And then we will finish off by talking a bit about some other influences on intelligence, like your environmental influences and things like that. So thanks for listening. This is our lecture for Friday's class, and then I do, as I mentioned at the beginning of the video, like to do one lecture per module. So even though some of the modules will only be maybe 15-20 minutes, while other ones will be a bit longer like this one, you should definitely be able to kind of finish your module within the time that would have been allotted for our class each day. So thanks for listening, and I will talk to you in the next video.